This is the Expert Series podcast from the CDA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Josh Malm, and it's Friday, December 5th, 2025. On today's episode of the Expert Series, CDA Institute Research Assistant Gabriella Calder was joined by Taillon and Howard Coombs for a discussion about Canada's plans to expand its reserve forces. Paul and Howard highlighted the challenges facing the system, everything from inefficient recruiting processes to training capacity issues and the need for better integration with the regular forces. They also explore the role of the supplementary reserve, the importance of modernizing training, and why these efforts are key to ensuring Canada's national security and sovereignty in an increasingly unpredictable global environment. Dr. and Colonel Paul Taillon is the Vice Chair of the Policy Insights Forum Selection Committee and has over 40 years of academic, intelligence, and military experience. Dr. Howard Coombs is an Associate Professor of History at the Royal Military College of Canada and Associate Director of Defence Engagement at the Queen's Centre for International and Defence Policy. He is also a part-time Canadian Army Reservist with the Canadian Defence Academy, also located in Kingston. And without further ado, we hope you enjoy this week's episode of the Expert Series.
We have a fantastic episode ahead of us today on Canada's bold and ambitious plan to increase the reserves. So if it's all right with you, I'd love to just jump right into the questions and get started.
All right. Well, I think it's important to start off with the Army Reserve component, also known as the primary reserve and the supplementary reserve are. The supplementary reserve consists of former and retired regular and/or reserve personnel who have committed to being brought back to service upon a personal request or by government, should a critical situation occur. But the supplementary reserve, which was once well numbered, is now, I gather, around 4,800 personnel. These are regular and reserve, but it's a very, very small pool of individuals that have military experience. And now they're recently targeted, as you're well aware, to expand to 300,000 plus when you consider that the 4,800 are still there. So, but the primary reserve or the reserve are part-time soldiers who've dedicated their spare time to serve as reserve officers and non-commissioned members of His Majesty's forces. And all these we have units right across Canada, approximately 157 units and subunits across Canada. And these people basically undergo their training, particularly as high school, university, and college students, because they have the time during the summers to do that. But the interesting thing is that we also have a naval and air reserve, but they're separate entities, and I won't be looking at them. I'm basically specifically looking at the Army Reserve. But for the most part, the supplementary reserve has not been a priority, and that's reflected in the dearth of numbers at 4,800. But it's also important to understand that the Army Reserve is a strategic asset amongst other assets that we have within the Canadian forces. And so it has to be addressed as such. And the primary reserve is the fundamental basis for military mobilization and, of course, expansion during a period of crisis. In tandem, it is a resource of trained personnel to augment the regular Army taskings or operations, both domestically and abroad. And we've seen this, going back through history. We've augmented the regular Army in Cyprus, former Yugoslavia, Afghanistan. 20 to 25% of personnel were reserve, and then all the way up to operations now in the Middle East, and also domestically during COVID and floods and that sort of thing, as you're well aware. So the recruiting target of 400,000 people, with 300,000 augmenting the supplementary reserve and another 100,000 augmenting the primary reserve component, it does pose a spectrum of challenges, one from attracting and recruiting personnel to orchestrating their basic training, the provision of a career and leadership courses, as well as integrating them into their home units, which is really a major issue. And as you're probably well aware, our recruiting system has been, if I may use the term boldly, problematic in the past, taking up to 2 years in some cases to recruit young men and women who have been basically volunteered to join, and some of which are second, third generation here. I know of one individual who applied at 17 and then got in at 19. Which is 2 years waiting for a part-time job. Not too many young people are going to wait that long. Hope springs eternal. But the fact is that these young people require part-time jobs, and they're also looking at possible futures. Recently, I was down in the States, and I bounced into a young Marine recruiter. And I asked him, how long does it take for you to recruit a civilian from the street? And he said between 35 and 55 days, which would incorporate his intelligence test, physical, medical, career, criminal check, and an educational check. You have to have a high school there. And if all went well, you'd be at the Marine Recruit Depot between 35 and 55 days. So I was duly impressed. But he said it gets even better. He says, if I find out that the student is going to graduate in June, I will go to the principal, request a letter confirming that, and then we could start the paperwork while that young man or woman is still at high school. And we allow them to go to their high school graduation, and then a week later, they're at the recruit depot. Wow, that is really breaking the paradigm from our point of view. But we also, as you're probably well aware, we have a problem in our training pipeline, and that's due to a lack of instructors, course vacancies, equipment, money, as well as training facilities, because our combat arms school can only take so many young infantry, armor, artillery people, and the same thing as our officer courses and their professional courses that they conduct there. So this continues to be a source of great concern, and it is a serious set of obstacles, if we're going to basically pursue those numbers. So this situation will only be exacerbated because of these numbers. And the other aspect that I find rather interesting is, as far as the supplementary reserve, the aspirations of 300,000 is truly extraordinary. And then to undertake only 1 week of training to include, let's say, weapons training, driver instruction, in some cases, how to fly drones, as you know, it's much more complex than that. And having served in the infantry, weapons training is very extensive. Driver training is anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks, depending on what vehicle you're driving. And then, of course, the learning of flying sort of drones effectively are far more difficult than one thinks. So as one who's, like for myself, I've conducted technical and leadership courses in my military career. I find it unfathomable that one would accomplish these basic skill sets after a short 1 week course, and with a follow-on of maybe 5 days a year. I just find that truly, to give you a comparative, that's a supplementary reserve. For a primary Canadian soldier in the Canadian infantry, the training consists of 21 weeks. And it's broken down into a 9-week basic military qualification, what we call BMQ, and a 12-week infantry course called Developmental Program 1. So you're looking at 21 weeks. And if you look at other countries, it's interesting because I've spent 5 years with the Brits and the British military. The Royal Marines, their basic training probably is the longest in NATO, consists of 32 weeks long. And that's conducted at the Commando Training Center at Lympton and Devon. And this program includes individual skills, team and section skills, troop and urban skills, and a commando phase. And I'm sure that training program for the supplementary reserve will be the subject of much discussion in the future, considering how small it is. But as you can appreciate, the complexities of modern conflict require extensive preparatory training for those who wish to undertake military training. And the proposed course description, as we've seen, does not meet the requirements of modern military training nor operations domestically or expeditionarily. So it's also reported that these supplementary reservists would not be issued uniforms, which could be problematic should they be operationalized to assist in domestic operations, because the laws of war dictate there should be uniform. I must commend Lieutenant General Mike Wright, the commander of the Canadian Army. He has clearly pointed out that we are at a critical juncture and has made that point quite clearly. As the army that he says, as the army that we have today is not the army that we need in the future, and we're the most part unprepared for major combat operations against peer-to-peer adversaries. Now, the general, well, in my view, he clearly acknowledges that the reserve forces lack integration and capacity, and therefore that's going to have to be addressed, and that's paramount to provide an expeditionary recruitment, training, equipment, and the broad set of skill sets found in professional arms, and enable integration and enhanced capability. So, from my point of view, there's a lot of work to do. And I'm only speaking of the primary reserve. I believe we're going to have to professionalize to be capable in this new operational capacity as a domestic division, a home defense division. So that's going to require an upgrading in our technical and leadership capabilities within the reserve. And for those regular force staff planners, I wonder if they had the opportunity to talk to real-time reservists, those that are not on active duty, and former reservists who've had to deal with the spectrum of professional and personal challenges that we inherit in being a reserve as an NCM, non-commissioned member, or as an officer. This may go a long way in meeting our obstacles. Some of the issues that have come up, when we talk about, how do we do this? We did in the 1990s conditional enrollment. So you join a unit, as a recruit, and you'd be there for 2 to 3 weeks. And should subsequent information that would prevent him or her of joining, be it a criminal issue, a security or medical issue, for example, that identify the individual would not be acceptable, we could then release them not fit for military service. But at least they're in the pipeline. They're being trained. They're being, if you will, indoctrinated into their career path, which is important, be it infantry, armor, artillery, a technical trade, or signals, whatever. But this large number of personnel begs also a question, how are they going to be trained? And that's going to be, we have to facilitate professional military training. One needs the same equipment, the same training as our regular force counterparts. And if this is truly the aspiration to go to regular reserve integration, there's only one way of doing it, and that's equivalent training. And ideally, training together. And overwhelmingly, our soldiers are overwhelmingly high school, university, and college people. So the best time to train them is during their summers, where you can facilitate not only a job, but you could assist in their career development as officers and non-commissioned members. So I think that's really kind of an important aspect that we have to take a look at. As far as the supplementary reserve, that increase, it strikes me as this is more of a civil defense program. It should be integrated in the whole of government strategy to address issues that flow from, let's say, climatic change or a national disaster, such as flooding or mass evacuations, national medical emergencies, etc. Therefore, there's a requirement, in my view, of a civil defense organization that would fully integrate and execute the planning for all those sectors of society, including the government, private companies, and citizens, into essentially a national disaster relief organization. And we may want to look at a separate civil defense organization, basically that is similar to what Germany has done. So they've got a group of people, an organization, they do the planning, and they have call upon the requirements should they have a national disaster. So that's really my view as to the complexities of this massive increase.
As we have discussed previously prior, increases in personnel have been announced for the primary reserve to 300,000 versus 100,000 for the supplementary reserve forces. In your view, how will the mission sets differ for each component, particularly considering this increase?
Well, it's interesting. Again, this is a lot of, shall we say, less than ideal information coming out on this. What I'm seeing, quite frankly, is a supplementary reserve seems to be, for lack of another word, a manpower pool for what was in the past with the governmental task of what we called national survival, or better known during the 1960s as snakes and ladders. And this is essentially national survival issues. The primary task of the Canadian militia at that time was national survival duties, and this is part of what we call civil defense. In the event of a nuclear war, for example, these duties included organizing food and medical supplies, basically to seek out the survivors of an atomic attack, minimizing radiation casualties, and essentially commanding rescue operations and resupply. So it wasn't something that the militia at that time was quite keen on. Now, as you might remember, or that from a historical point of view, this was the Cold War, and it was a perceived threat of an imminent nuclear attack. And as we saw time and time again, that fear was basically imbued within the Western world. But the Canadian government sought to address these military manpower shortages by implementing what they call the Special Militia Training Plan, which was in the late 1961, and it aimed to recruit about 100,000 civilians, basically to undertake those missions that I mentioned to you. But on the same time, the warfighting capability of the reserve diminished dramatically, and this neglect and underfunding by the mid-60s basically brought about low numbers and low morale, a lack of resources, and obviously a clear lack of purpose. So in my personal belief is that I look at Germany, Finland, a number of other countries, maybe we should be looking at purely a civil defense organization and don't put it under the rubric of national defense. National defense would be a part of the whole of government, but not that. But when we consider, climatic change, fire, floods, as well as a medical issue that we had during COVID, there's a growing importance of domestic defense and security, particularly now, as we're seeing, we've got a number of existential threats. And arguably, when I read a RCMP report of 6 months ago, there's potential for domestic issues. We also have a major challenge in the Arctic. We're going to have to see a major expansion in the primary reserve, and also ideally within a separate organization, a civil defense organization that's manned, equipped, and furnished with the monies to deal with this stuff. So I think we should look at what Germany has done in particular, because they've equipped and coordinated a number of operations under government auspices. And there's a small thing here, Gabriel, which I find fascinating. Okay? People join the Army Reserve to become soldiers, to understand what soldiering is about, to have a physical and mental challenge, and develop their leadership skills within the reserve rubric. And it is my experience, it is important to appreciate that well-trained soldiers can participate and conduct, everything, essentially civil defense operations in particular. You can work down, so to speak, into floods, flooding, national disasters, etc. It's more difficult for reserve to work up because you don't have the time. All right. So it's important to train your people as a tier 1 in their military occupational specialty. And so again, when you are preparing the Army Reserve for domestic operations, which would also include warfighting, should someone, let's just say a belligerent, lands in the Arctic, what are you going to do with that? Regular and reserve forces are going to go up, have to conduct some warfighting operations. So I think there is some serious issues that we're going to have to look at, because domestically, you have Defense of Canada, you'll have aid to the civil power. What happens if you have a massive and coordinated terrorist attack across Canada, or civil disturbance across Canada? One never knows. So you're going to have a reserve, a primary reserve, that has a high degree of training, discipline, and physical prowess. And they have to be well trained to basically address these challenges. So I think there's a number of issues that are going to have to be addressed in that regard. And the supplementary reserve may be useful to identify personnel that have important skills, such as, doctors, medical people, former police, former military people, engineers, emergency planners, amongst others. I think that is something that is endemic within that organization. And this is where I hark back to, it's important for the Army to understand what sort of skill sets you have other than your military ones. And I use the time when I was in Afghanistan. I had a young Sikh reservist, Sikh Canadian, wonderful fellow. But he came to me and said, your Afghan interpreter is not really very good. And I asked him, what do you know? Well, it turned out he spoke, Hindi, Urdu, Pashto. That was part of his family. And as a young boy, his friends were of that ilk. And at the same time, you had the television programs that were being shown had all those language skill sets. So if you're a young boy or a young girl, you're going to watch cartoons in all 3 languages. So I thought, wow. But it was not of interest to the armed forces at the time. They wanted to know if he spoke English or French. So that's another aspect that I think is kind of interesting. But flowing from this, Gabriel, is something I learned when I was with our American colleagues, is maybe we should have an immediate ready reserve. Someone like yourself, for volunteers, you're well trained, and you sit back and say, listen, I've talked to my job. I've got my physical training program and test done, my weapons test done. I am ready to go and deploy within 7 days. So that makes you a part of the immediate ready reserve. That would focus a number of people who are DAG, what we call green, able to operate immediately. It would create a small group of people voluntary, ready to go, instead of, we need a doctor. Well, you happen to have a doctor that was on the IRR. So you pick him or her and you can send them off. So I think there's an issue here that we may have ignored as an immediate regular reserve, but that's just something for the future.
Thank you very much for your time and perspectives on this issue today. It was truly a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you, Gabriel.
Up next, we spoke with Howard Coombs, who provides a historical context and evolution of the reserve forces, outlines some of the current challenges and the future direction that the forces need to go in, as well as the need for a coherent and deliberate approach to increasing reserve capacity to ensure Canada's long-term security and sovereignty. Here's part 2 of the episode.
Could you contextualize if Canada actually needs a reserve force, and what is it, and why is it so important to national security and defense?
Well, Gabrielle, I think you're asking a core question that we as Canadians have been trying to answer for several hundred years. I'll give you a bit of a historical overview because that's kind of how I look at things, and then I'll take it to today. So really, the reserve or the militia in Canada in its earliest form was a part-time force that had very low training standards. It was a force of last resort, meant for emergencies, defense from the Americans, for example. But things that there were enough active duty, or we call it regular forces, to deal with. But at the end of the day, they were given minimal resources, minimal time to train. And although there was laws, the Militia Acts, which compelled people to be part of the militia, it was recognized that this would only happen if it was an extremis emergency. And then as we roll forward into the 19th century, the British, as members of the British Empire, we adopted defense agreements that supported the British Empire. And our defense planning was done by British officers, particularly in Canada. And we actually had some fairly comprehensive mobilization plans prior to the First World War, which the Minister of Defense in 1914, Sir Sam Hughes, binned. And he just did a call to arms, have everybody muster at Valcartier. We formed a Canadian Expeditionary Force. After the war, we disbanded the Expeditionary Force, and we perpetuated its battle honors, the things that it commemorated, in the militia units that existed at the time. And then we fast forward to the Second World War, and although we have our mobilization is a little bit more coherent, actually I'd say a lot more coherent, and we activate militia reserve units, and the reserve units provide the force generation base for the rest of the war. They provide recruiting centers. Sometimes they're activated and sent overseas to either become units in the Canadian Army, because this is mostly army folks at this point in time, in terms of how we were using our reserve, or they are broken up for reinforcements. After the war, we walk out of the Second World War with a very sizable force across Army, Navy, Air Force. And there's a lot of debate in the post-war period, particularly with the advent of atomic weapons, nuclear weapons today, about what does our standing force look like? What does Canadian defense look like? And it's decided by the 1950s that the focus has to be on standing forces, or forces in being, and reserve forces or militia forces aren't very useful because they require time to train and get ready and deploy, which can be considerable, because we see in the Second World War, the forces we send into the UK that participated in the battles in Europe in 1944 have years to train and get ready. And even the ones that we dispatched to Italy in 1943 have been training in Europe for several years. So that's acknowledged that there's a fairly large training burden to prepare forces. So we go straight to, okay, we're going to focus on regular forces, and then the reserve forces will be diminished, and the resources that we're expending on reserve forces will go to regular forces. And Canada adopts a different attitude than many of our allies towards that. So because while the Europeans and the Americans keep fairly large reserve forces, we do not. And part of it is about the vagaries of budgets over the years. So the defense budget, as it diminishes, you have the politicians who are in charge of defense, and the soldiers, sailors, and the air personnel who run defense on behalf of the government, saying, okay, we have to make budget choices, so we're going to invest in our regular forces, which are forced in being, rather than our reserve forces. But then, by the 1980s, 1990s, we realized that we need to be better at integrating our reserve forces with our regular forces. And actually, in the 1970s, we start talking about total force. Yeah. So what we're trying to do, though, is leverage the reserve forces on the cheap. So we don't want to put a lot of money into it, but we want to have some capacity that we can move over to supplement regular forces. And that's kind of how we approach this in the 70s. And it's a very service-specific approach. So the Army maintains reserve units, and they're not particularly big units, but they could be used to generate more forces for the Army. The Air Force, its reserve is on mostly individual augmentation to the regular force. The Navy has reserve units, but they use those reserve units to crew regular ships. So it's, but not as units. The individuals from those reserve units go to crew the ships. So every service treats it differently. So now we roll into the 1990s in Afghanistan, the commitments in Yugoslavia, and Afghanistan end up eating up big chunks of the reserve forces across the table, but all as individual augmentation. What we're seeing now is something different. Okay, that's the best way to put it. So what we're now seeing is guidance from the CDS and the deputy minister to plan for a very large-scale reserve mobilization, and it indicates that there will be a degree of centralization of structure and use that hasn't been seen, well, in decades, if ever. So so while the environment, the Army, Navy, Air Force, and to a certain extent, SOF also has their own little small reserve. While they will still have control over the reserves that are affiliated with those forces, I think they will be centrally directed. And because it's in the nature of when you want to increase your standing reserve to 100,000 people, then there has to be centralized control about how that works. So to go back to your original question, why we need a reserve, the reason we're doing this now is that there are existential threats. And I think Canadians are recognizing that at this point in time, and that Canada is not, in terms of its geographical location, that doesn't assure us a degree of safety that it did in, for example, the 1930s. And we have not been paying attention because we have, frankly, looked to our neighbors to the south and had expectations that they would take care of continental defense. And it is very apparent that now the Americans are not going to shoulder our share of the burden. And it's been very explicit in both the policy statements and the rhetoric coming out of the current American administration. So now we have no choice but to deal with the delta or the missing piece of Canadian defense that we have not paid any attention to since, the Second World War. And it's a big catch-up. And so I would say for Canadians, the reality is we do need a reserve force because we are now expected to take our share of continental defense, national emergencies, and be prepared to contribute to NATO with viable, ready, and resilient forces. So I know that's a bit of a meandering discussion. Did I get to the crux of your question, though? Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Just to shift our perspective a little bit, given your personal research on Canadian force development and training, where would you say the major friction points exist in today's reserve and generation system? And do you think the new mobilization framework will meaningfully reduce bottlenecks in these areas in the near term?
That's a super perceptive question based on where we're sitting right now. So simply put, right now, the bottlenecks in reserve recruiting and training and retention is not. Reserve recruiting has devolved to reserve units. So recruiting isn't the issue it was a few years ago. Neither is it the issue that it is for the regular forces. So when we talk about all these recruiting problems, they really don't apply as much to the regular force or to the reserve force, I should say, because the reserve force has more control of the recruiting, which is great. So the biggest problem we're seeing across the reserve forces I believe in the Army in particular, not so much in the Navy and Air Force for reasons I'll tell you in a second, but still the Navy has similar problems, but not to the same extent, is that we don't have training capacity. So back in the late 1990s, until the late 1990s, early 2000s, the regular force trained the reserves. And there was a number of reasons for that. First of all, reservists were not qualified to the same standards or same bands of excellence, if we look at it in terms of competencies, that regular forces were. So it was reserves couldn't really train themselves in all areas because they weren't qualified to train themselves. So they needed regular training. So the regular force across the Army and Navy in particular was focused on reserve training in times of the year when they weren't being employed. And they would pump through tons of reservists and keep reserve forces going. But once, as the demand for active regular forces, active duty forces for us, increased in the 90s and Afghanistan, there was no capacity to train reserve forces. So reserve forces were expected to train themselves. At the same time, there was an expectation of militia, and they became increasingly viewed and used as a reserve in the early 2000s, and that's why we call them reserves now, because we changed the training standards. Reservists were expected to reach the same competencies, particularly in the Army, that regulars were doing. So it increased the training burden, but at the same time, we don't have regulars to do the training. And today we're in a situation where we're training the Army and Navy in particular, training to similar levels, using reservists to train them, but there's not enough reserve leadership to train the numbers of reservists that they're recruiting in order to fill the empty positions. So the bottleneck really is training capacity right now. Now, for the Air Force, because the way they recruit and retain, a lot of their reserves are simply regulars that are switching over to the reserve. So they're already trained. So that's not a problem. Navy, similarly, they will retain regulars if they can, but at the same time, they have less people, and they've always integrated their reserve training with their regular training. But they too have bottlenecks in their capacity, because right now, for example, I teach at the Royal Military College of Canada. It's taking 1 to 2 years for a naval officer a potential naval officer who graduates to get into the training system. So they simply don't have capacity. So what the Army Reserve has done is they have said, okay, we'll bring you on board, but we won't train you. We'll pay you. If we can't get you on training, we'll pay you to do things in summertime. And then when we have a spot for you on training within maybe a year or two, we'll get you on it. But that's a problem too, because young men and women don't join the reserve to sit and get paid or to do busy work. They join because they want to do stuff. That's part of the attraction of putting on a uniform. It's service, but it's also an exciting form of service. So for me, in answer to your question, problem is training capacity. Because if we can't get people through the training system, we can't qualify them, we can't use them in any capacity because there are incredible limitations on their usage until they're trained, and they won't stick around because they're not trained, they're not doing anything. So right now we have to figure out, how do we increase training capacity for the reserve forces, but at the same time, deal with all the other commitments that they have to just running themselves. We can't simply rely on the regular force because they're busy. If you look at regular force commitments, just trying to get themselves to a point where they're functional and meet all their defense commitments is a struggle at this point in time. So I would say the issue is we have to increase that, and we have to come up with some innovative ways to increase training capacity for reserve forces. And that could be contracting retired folks. We could even contract out to companies certain aspects of reserve training. We have to look at bodies of policy. For example, Veterans Affairs Canada has a whole host of wonderful education benefits and retraining benefits for people who leave the regular force, but they must completely release from the military to access that training, so they can't join the reserve. They can't be involved in reserve. So how do we address those kinds of policy issues? Need to be addressed, because we are, it's like we have trained people here who are leaving the military, but we can't use them because they have to leave the military in order to access retraining after they leave the military. So that's just a couple of things that I would suggest right now we have to look at. But if we are going to bring people into an expanding reserve force, we need to increase the training capacity in order to get them, at least the high readiness reserve forces, to a level where they could actually work individually or collectively with regular forces.
As Canada pushes towards a more resilient and mobilizable force, what are the key risks you see in executing this plan too quickly? And conversely, what risks do you see potentially emerging if Canada fails to build a meaningful reserve capacity over this next and very crucial decade?
Department of National Defense and the Government of Canada are dancing on a razor's edge right now. There's an acknowledgement by the country that something needs to be done. That something can take many forms, and right now the government is prioritizing defense and industry, Canadian industry, the economic side of the house, as key sectors that have to be dealt with. There is a dilemma between moving too quickly and not quickly enough. So right now there is support, and the government has to take advantage of the support. It has to put things in, so the budget is part of this. It has to put things in motion that once started, the inertia and the policy guidelines and the laws that have been enacted, and directives and everything else like that, will take these projects to fruition. It's going to take years. And I don't see some of the outcomes being achievable in less than 7 to 10 years. At the same time, if we move too slowly and cautiously, we are going to lose support, and we're going to lose the current impetus to get something done. And if that happens, we are going to be no better off than we are now. We might even be worse, because as one can see in the wider what's going on in terms of international relations right now, we are reprioritizing our alliances. We are moving money to different parts of the world, different sectors that we haven't, and countries that we haven't done before. And we are, in fact, burning bridges, some might say, with the United States. The current American ambassador in particular, I was reading the latest news and some of the things that he's saying. And the bottom line is he's arguing on behalf of the United States that we are not being good neighbors, and we should continue to engage as we have in the past, despite any rhetoric coming out of the current U.S. administration. So if we move too slowly, or we don't follow through on this, we will be in a position where we have disenfranchised our good ally, the United States, who've been our biggest partner, who are still going to be a large partner, a dominant influence in Canadian life. But at the same time, we will have created fractured relations with them, and we won't have follow through on new partnerships and alliances, and we won't be seen as a reliable partner by those other countries that we're now engaging with. So I am arguing that we have to move right now, but we have to do it deliberately and rather quickly, I would argue, but not so quickly that we throw caution to the wind. And a great example would be, just say, you're doing your home budget, and all of a sudden we say, oh my God, I've got a whole bunch of bonuses coming in. I can do anything with my bonuses. And you spend it. Like you say, oh geez, I'd love to do this, this, and this. And you just go spend it, but it's not coherent. And it won't get you the best effects for your money. And that is the danger that the mobilization directors and guidance that we're hearing out of defense is trying to eliminate. By having a coordinated approach to this and arguing that we should have larger coordination, the Department of National Defense is acknowledging that we need to take all these resources that are being made available and focus them in a way that we can achieve a degree of success. And to further answer your question, if we fail, if we don't increase the reserves, if we don't increase military capacity, if we don't enhance our defense and security, we give up our sovereignty. And that will be our sovereignty on not just a physical level, but sovereignty in cyberspace, on the diplomatic level, and economic sovereignty. So we have no choice but to be successful right now, because if we are not, I think we will allow ourselves to become very diminished as a nation, and we run the risk of being subsumed by the economic sphere of the United States, and that will lead to in the end, and I'm not trying to be alarmist, but if we give up our rights to defense and economic sovereignty, we might as well just say, go along with what the current president of the United States is saying, is it become the 51st state. So unless we can demonstrate that we have our own economic sovereignty and we're self-governing, we're capable of our own defense and international contributions, we will not be able to continue to exist as the Canada we know today.
Thank you very much for your perspectives on this topic. It was truly a pleasure to have you on and to get your insights on this critical issue. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Gabrielle.
And that's all for today's episode. The Expert Series is released every Friday. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's edition, email Josh at cdainstitute.ca. I'm Josh Malm. Until next time.